On the morning of September 18, 1970, something happened in a quiet London apartment that would shock the entire music world. A 27-year-old man who had changed rock music forever was suddenly gone. That man was Jimi Hendrix. At the time, the news spread fast. Radio stations interrupted their programming. Fans across the United States and Europe heard the same thing again and again. Jimi Hendrix was dead. The official explanation seemed simple. Authorities said he had taken sleeping pills after drinking wine. At some point during the night, he vomited and choked in his sleep. It was labeled an accident. Just another tragic death in the world of rock and roll. But almost immediately, something about the story didn't sit right with people. Friends started noticing details that didn't match. Witnesses gave statements that seemed to change over time. People who had been close to Hendrix in his final days began telling very different versions of what happened that night. And then there were the rumors. Some claimed Hendrix had been planning to fire people in his management team. Others said millions of dollars were tied to his career and insurance policies. Years passed, then decades. But the questions never really disappeared. Investigators, journalists, and even some former associates kept returning to the same moment in time, the final hours of Jimi Hendrix's life. What actually happened inside that apartment? Why were some details of the case never fully explained? And why did certain people seem so eager to close the investigation so quickly? As new interviews surfaced and old documents were examined again, a darker picture slowly began to appear. A story about fame, control, money, and secrets. To understand how things reached that point, we have to go back long before the night Hendrix died. Back to the beginning. Back to Seattle. Jimi Hendrix was born on November 27, 1942, in Seattle, Washington. His birth name was Johnny Allen Hendrix. His early life was anything but easy. His father, James Allen Hendrix, was serving in the U.S. Army when Jimi was born. His mother, Lucille Hendrix, was only 17 years old. Their relationship was unstable from the start. Money was always tight. Arguments were common. And the young couple struggled to build a stable home. When James returned from the military, he changed his son's name to James Marshall Hendrix. But even after he came home, things didn't get better. Jimi's parents fought constantly. Their relationship was filled with alcohol, shouting, and long separations. Eventually they divorced. During those years, young Jimi often moved from one relative's home to another. Sometimes he stayed with his grandmother, other times with family friends. Stability was rare. At school, Jimi was quiet and shy. Teachers noticed he spent a lot of time by himself. But there was one thing that caught everyone's attention: music. When Jimi was a kid, he didn't even have a real guitar at first. He carried around a broom and pretended it was a guitar. Teachers sometimes found him sitting alone, moving his fingers along the broom handle like he was playing songs. He was completely absorbed in it. Eventually, his father bought him a cheap acoustic guitar for about $5. That moment changed everything. From that point on, Jimi rarely put the instrument down. Neighbors remembered hearing him play for hours inside the house. Friends said he took the guitar with him almost everywhere. He listened closely to blues records by artists like Muddy Waters, B.B. King, and Howlin' Wolf. He didn't just copy what they played. He experimented. He twisted notes in strange ways. He bent strings harder than most guitar players did at the time. He played rhythms that sounded unusual. People around him didn't fully understand what he was trying to do. But Jimi did. Music had become his escape from the chaos at home. Still, life wasn't easy. In 1958, when Jimi was only 15 years old, his mother Lucille died suddenly from health complications related to alcoholism. Her death hit him hard. Family members later said Jimi didn't talk about it much. Instead, he spent even more time playing guitar. It was the one place where he felt in control. By the time he reached his late teens, it was clear that music wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was the center of his life. But the road ahead would be far from smooth. In the early 1960s, Jimi Hendrix was still just another struggling musician trying to survive. He played wherever he could. Small bars, clubs, dance halls. Sometimes the pay was barely enough to cover food. Other nights, he walked away with nothing. Around this time, Hendrix got into trouble with the law after being caught driving a stolen car. Instead of going to jail, he chose to join the U.S. Army. But even there, things didn't work out. Jimi spent most of his free time playing guitar. Other soldiers remembered him constantly practicing instead of focusing on military duties. After about a year, he was discharged. Once he returned to civilian life, Hendrix jumped straight back into music. He started playing as a backup guitarist for touring bands. This meant standing in the background while someone else was the star. One of the biggest artists he worked with was Little Richard. At first, it looked like a big opportunity. Little Richard was already famous, and touring with him meant performing in front of huge audiences. But the job didn't last long. Hendrix had a habit that annoyed band leaders. He experimented too much. During performances, he sometimes added unusual guitar sounds or improvised solos that weren't part of the show. To Hendrix, that was the fun of playing music. To the people running the band, it looked like he was trying to steal attention from the main performer. Eventually, he was fired. The same thing happened when he worked with the Isley Brothers. They respected his talent, but Hendrix's style was unpredictable. Some nights he played perfectly. Other nights he pushed the guitar into strange directions that confused people. Money was still a constant problem. Hendrix often slept on friends' couches. Sometimes he stayed in cheap hotels. There were periods when he didn't even have a permanent place to live. But despite the struggle, his reputation among musicians slowly grew. People started noticing something unusual about his playing. He treated the guitar almost like it was a completely different instrument. He used feedback, distortion, and volume in ways most guitarists had never attempted before. One night in New York, a musician in the audience watched Hendrix perform and immediately realized he was seeing something special. That musician was Chas Chandler, the bassist from the British band The Animals. Chandler believed Hendrix could become a huge star. But not in America. He believed the place where Hendrix would truly be appreciated was London. That idea would change everything. Within months, Hendrix packed his guitar and boarded a plane to England. He had no idea that the next stage of his life would transform him into one of the most famous musicians on the planet. And it would also begin the chain of events that eventually led to one of the most mysterious deaths in rock history. When Jimi Hendrix arrived in London in late 1966, almost nobody there had heard of him. He was just another American guitar player carrying a worn guitar case and a few personal belongings. But the man who brought him there, Chas Chandler, believed something big was about to happen. Chandler had seen Hendrix play in a small club in New York. What he saw that night stayed in his head. Hendrix wasn't just playing guitar. He was doing things with it that felt completely new. Chandler helped him build a band. Soon, Hendrix teamed up with drummer Mitch Mitchell and bassist Noel Redding. Together they formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience. At first, they played small London clubs. The rooms were packed with musicians who had heard rumors about the strange American guitarist. Word spread fast. One night, a few members of the Beatles showed up to watch him perform. Other famous musicians started appearing in the crowd too. They were curious. They had never seen someone play guitar the way Hendrix did. He bent the strings until they screamed. He turned the amplifier into part of the instrument. He controlled feedback in ways that most guitarists tried to avoid. Sometimes he played with his teeth. Other times he played behind his back. The music sounded wild but controlled at the same time. By early 1967, the band released their first single, Hey Joe. The song quickly climbed the charts in the United Kingdom. Then came another hit, Purple Haze. The sound was unlike anything people had heard before. Radio stations played it constantly. Within months, Hendrix had gone from a struggling backup guitarist to one of the most talked about musicians in the world. Then came the moment that pushed his fame even higher. In 1967, Hendrix traveled to California to perform at the legendary Monterey Pop Festival. Many people in the United States still didn't know who he was. That changed in one night. At the end of his performance, Hendrix did something that shocked the audience. He poured lighter fluid on his guitar. Then he set it on fire. The crowd stared in disbelief as the flames rose from the instrument. It wasn't just a stunt. It felt like a symbol. A new kind of rock star had arrived. After Monterey, Hendrix's fame exploded across America. Concert halls filled up everywhere he went. His album Are You Experienced became one of the most influential rock records ever released. But the sudden rise to fame came with pressure, and the pace of his life began to spin faster and faster. By the late 1960s, Jimi Hendrix was no longer just a musician. He was a global phenomenon. Concert promoters wanted him everywhere. Record companies wanted more albums. Fans expected bigger performances every time he stepped on stage. The schedule became overwhelming. Hendrix traveled constantly: London, New York, Los Angeles, Paris, Berlin. Sometimes he performed several nights in a row in different cities. Sleep became rare. Long flights, late-night shows, and endless interviews started wearing him down. Friends later said that Hendrix often looked exhausted. To cope with the pressure, he started relying more heavily on alcohol and drugs. Marijuana and LSD were common in the music scene at the time, and Hendrix was surrounded by people who used them regularly. But another habit slowly became more dangerous: sleeping pills. Because of the constant travel, Hendrix had trouble falling asleep. Doctors sometimes prescribed strong sedatives to help him rest. Over time, he began taking them more often. Sometimes he mixed them with alcohol. People close to him noticed the change. He still played incredible shows, but off-stage he sometimes looked drained. At the same time, business problems were building behind the scenes. Hendrix didn't fully control his career. Contracts, money, and touring decisions were often handled by his manager, Michael Jeffery. Jeffery had helped guide Hendrix's rise to fame, but their relationship was complicated. Some friends said Hendrix felt trapped by the business arrangements around him. There were arguments about money, arguments about touring, arguments about the direction of his music. Hendrix wanted more freedom, but the system around him had become huge. Millions of dollars were now tied to his career. Concert promoters, record labels, and managers all depended on the Hendrix machine continuing to run. And that machine required him to keep performing, even when he was exhausted. As Jimi Hendrix became more famous, the circle of people around him grew larger. Some were close friends, others were business partners, and some were people who simply wanted to be near a rock star. One of the most powerful figures in Hendrix's life was his manager, Michael Jeffery. Jeffery was known as a tough businessman. He negotiated major deals and organized massive tours that brought in huge profits. But not everyone trusted him. Some people in Hendrix's circle believed Jeffery controlled too much of the business side of things. There were whispers that Hendrix didn't fully understand how much money his concerts and albums were making. Around this time, Hendrix had also started a relationship with a German woman named Monika Dannemann. Dannemann was an artist who spent time with Hendrix during the final months of his life. She would later become one of the most important witnesses in the story of his death. But in 1970, she was simply known as Hendrix's girlfriend. Friends described their relationship as complicated. Sometimes they seemed happy together. Other times they argued. People around Hendrix also noticed that he had begun talking about major changes in his life. He wanted to start new musical projects. He talked about creating his own recording studio. And according to several associates, Hendrix had started thinking about leaving parts of his management team behind. If that happened, it could have changed the flow of money around his career. For the first time since becoming famous, Hendrix seemed interested in taking control of his business decisions. But these conversations were happening quietly, mostly behind closed doors. Only a handful of people knew how serious he was about making those changes. And as summer turned into fall in 1970, Hendrix's life was beginning to reach a turning point. Within weeks, everything would come to a sudden and tragic end. And the last night of his life would leave behind a trail of unanswered questions that people are still debating more than 50 years later. By September 1970, Jimi Hendrix had been living a fast, exhausting life for several years. Touring had slowed down a little, but the pressure around him hadn't disappeared. In the days before his death, Hendrix was staying in London. He had been moving between different apartments and hotels while spending time with his girlfriend, Monika Dannemann. On the evening of September 17th, Hendrix and Dannemann went out together. They spent part of the night visiting friends and listening to music. Several people later said Hendrix seemed tired that night. Not depressed, not angry, just worn out. Later in the evening, the two returned to Dannemann's apartment at the Samarkand Hotel. Inside the apartment, they talked for a while and drank wine. At some point during the night, Hendrix took sleeping pills. The pills were a strong prescription medication called Vesparax, which was commonly used in Europe at the time to treat severe insomnia. According to the original report, Hendrix swallowed several tablets before going to bed. But this is where the timeline begins to get confusing. Dannemann later said Hendrix went to sleep normally. She claimed everything seemed calm. Sometime early the next morning, she said she noticed something was wrong. Hendrix was unresponsive. Panic followed. She called for help, and an ambulance was sent to the apartment. Paramedics arrived and rushed Hendrix to St. Mary Abbott's Hospital. But when they arrived, doctors could not save him. He was pronounced dead at just 27 years old. The news spread across the world within hours. Fans were stunned. Another major rock star had died young. And at first, it looked like a tragic accident. But the details surrounding that night would soon begin to raise serious questions. After Jimi Hendrix died, authorities began an investigation to determine the cause. An autopsy was performed in London. The medical examiner concluded that Hendrix had died from asphyxiation. According to the report, he had taken a large amount of the sleeping medication Vesparax. Those pills were extremely strong. Even one tablet could put someone into a deep sleep. Investigators believed Hendrix had taken multiple pills while also drinking alcohol. At some point during the night, he vomited while unconscious. Because he was so heavily sedated, he wasn't able to wake up or move. The official explanation said he choked in his sleep. The death was ruled accidental. No evidence of suicide was found. No criminal charges were filed. Within a short time, the investigation was closed. For authorities, the case appeared straightforward. But not everyone accepted that explanation. Several people who knew Hendrix personally started asking questions. Why had he taken so many pills? Why were there inconsistencies in the timeline of the night he died? And why did some witness statements seem to contradict each other? Journalists who looked deeper into the case began noticing unusual gaps. The timeline of when the ambulance was called didn't fully match other accounts. Details about how Hendrix was found also changed slightly depending on who was telling the story. At first, these differences seemed small. But over time, they began to grow more noticeable. And that's when the mystery surrounding Hendrix's death started to deepen. In the years following the death of Jimi Hendrix, the story about his final night began shifting. The most important witness was still Monika Dannemann. She had been the last known person with Hendrix before he died. In her first statements to authorities, Dannemann described a simple timeline. They returned to the apartment. Hendrix took sleeping pills. She went to sleep. Later, she woke up and found him unresponsive. But over the years, her account began to change in small ways. In some interviews, she said Hendrix had taken 9 sleeping pills. In others, she suggested it might have been fewer. The exact timeline of when she discovered him also shifted depending on the interview. Some journalists noticed another strange detail. The amount of medication found in Hendrix's body suggested a much larger dose than originally reported. That raised another question. Did Hendrix actually take the pills himself? Or had something else happened inside that apartment? Other people connected to Hendrix's final days also began sharing stories. Some said Hendrix had seemed worried about business issues. Others said he had talked about making major changes in his career. There were rumors he wanted to leave certain management agreements behind. Those rumors became more interesting when people began looking closely at his manager, Michael Jeffery. Jeffery had been deeply involved in Hendrix's career. He controlled major financial deals, tours, and contracts. If Hendrix walked away from those agreements, it could have cost Jeffery millions of dollars. At first, these ideas sounded like conspiracy theories. But as more interviews surfaced and new claims appeared decades later, investigators and journalists began revisiting the case again. They started asking the same question fans had been asking since 1970. Was Jimi Hendrix's death really just a tragic accident? Or was there something much darker behind it? By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the mystery surrounding Jimi Hendrix had taken a darker turn. For years, people had questioned the official explanation of his death. But now, some former insiders were starting to make much more serious accusations. One of the most shocking claims came from a man named James "Tappy" Wright. Wright had once worked closely with Hendrix's manager, Michael Jeffery. He had been part of the road crew during parts of Hendrix's career and had spent time around Jeffery's business operations. Decades after Hendrix's death, Wright made a statement that immediately grabbed attention. In interviews and later in a book, he claimed that Jeffery had once confessed something disturbing. According to Wright, Jeffery told him he had arranged Hendrix's death. The alleged reason was money. At the time, Hendrix's career was worth millions of dollars. Concert deals, record contracts, and merchandise were all tied to his name. But Wright claimed there was another financial factor: insurance. He said Jeffery had taken out a large life insurance policy on Hendrix, worth millions if the musician died while still under management. Wright claimed Jeffery told him that Hendrix had recently started talking about ending their business relationship. If Hendrix had broken away, Jeffery could have lost control of a huge financial empire. The claim suggested that someone may have had a powerful motive. But there was a major problem. There was no direct evidence, no documents, no witnesses to the alleged confession. Still, the accusation kept spreading. Journalists began digging into old financial records and management agreements. Some reports suggested Hendrix really had been considering major changes to his career. Friends said he had talked about wanting more control over his money and music. Others remembered him discussing plans to move away from certain business partners. The story grew even stranger when people looked at what happened to Michael Jeffery later. In 1973, Jeffery died in a plane crash in France. The crash destroyed the aircraft and killed everyone on board. With Jeffery gone, any chance of questioning him about the allegations disappeared forever. The mystery surrounding Hendrix's death suddenly had even more unanswered questions. More than 50 years after the death of Jimi Hendrix, the story is still being debated. In the decades following 1970, journalists, authors, and investigators repeatedly returned to the case. Each time they looked at the evidence again, they found the same thing: loose ends. The timeline of Hendrix's final night still raises questions. The exact number of sleeping pills taken has never been fully confirmed. Statements given by Monika Dannemann changed several times over the years, making it difficult to build a clear picture of what happened inside the apartment. Medical experts also pointed out unusual details in the autopsy report. Some said the amount of liquid found in Hendrix's lungs suggested he had inhaled large amounts of wine. That raised another question. If he had been deeply unconscious from sleeping pills, how could that much liquid enter his lungs without him waking up? These questions eventually caught the attention of modern investigators. In the 1990s and again in the 2000s, British authorities reviewed parts of the original case. Reporters also pushed for more transparency around the documents from the 1970 investigation. But the biggest problem was time. Many of the people involved were already dead. Important witnesses had passed away. Memories had faded. Documents had been lost or destroyed. Without new physical evidence, authorities could not reopen the case as a criminal investigation. Officially, Hendrix's death is still listed as an accidental overdose involving sleeping pills and alcohol. But the doubts have never disappeared. Fans, historians, and journalists continue to study the final hours of his life. Some believe the original explanation was correct. Others believe important details were overlooked or ignored. What remains certain is this: on September 18, 1970, the world lost one of the most revolutionary musicians in history. The sound created by Jimi Hendrix changed rock music forever. But the mystery surrounding his final night continues to follow his legacy. And even today, more than half a century later, people are still asking the same question. What really happened to Jimi Hendrix?